The next most important characteristic of a handgun to look at, or the most telling characteristic, if you will, is the width of that gun, how wide it is. The width is simply the measurement from one side of the slide to the other. Handgun width represents yet another important compromise, because the narrower the gun is, the easier it's going to be for you to conceal. And of course, the more comfortable it's going to be to carry concealed, because wider guns are bulkier, and of course they tend to be heavier than narrow guns. But wider guns are also more durable and more reliable. So let's talk about why that's the case and what side of this compromise you should land on. As much as advertisements in handgun magazines would like us to believe, wonder guns simply don't exist. I mean, yeah, ideally if we could make a gun the size of a quarter and carry it around, that would be the ultimate self-defense handgun. But the reality of the situation, and this is something we can never forget, because again, fancy marketing gimmicks will try to make us forget these things, but all handguns are ruled by physics, and physics is a very level playing field. And the other thing we have to remember is that all handgun manufacturers have available to them the same components and the same materials, the same metals, the same polymers. They have access to all these things. And so when we find that one handgun is made super thin and it's extremely comfortable, whereas another handgun is much wider and therefore a lot less comfortable to carry, we can't conclude from that that the people who designed this handgun are far more clever, because look at it. It's thinner, it's more comfortable. And these people must not know what they're doing, because look how thick it is. That's not the case at all. If a gun is as thin as a dime, then we know that the designers and engineers who made that gun had to make some serious compromises in that process. That's because quality materials that can withstand the brutal force that can sometimes be required of them, then they need space to do that. Heavy-duty components take up more space. Over-engineering takes up more space, and that is important in a handgun. Now, I'm not suggesting that we only look at the widest possible handguns. It's not quite that simple. But I think you will find that this decision is most often made for you, because when we're looking at the compromise between a wider gun and a narrower gun, you're going to find that just about all Tier 1 combat grade handguns are simply wide guns. Tier 1 combat guns tend to typically be between 30 and 32 millimeters wide. Compare that to a Tier 2 gun, one that is marketed as and has become very popular for self-defense. These guns can be as thin as 23 or 24, 25 millimeters wide. And the differences between the comfort of carrying the Tier 2 narrower gun and the Tier 1 gun are absolutely very noticeable. And I understand the allure of carrying a narrow gun, because they do disappear on your body in a much more comfortable way than the Tier 1 gun. However, all the qualities that make a Tier 1 combat gun desired by the people who ever have to experience combat dictate that these guns are going to be significantly wider than the Tier 2 guns. That's because people who know that their lives may depend on a handgun someday are more willing to endure a little bit of physical discomfort now to prevent a whole lot of physical discomfort or psychological discomfort later. And that is the balance that we're choosing with handgun width. The narrower a gun is, the more comfortable it'll be, but the less durable and the less reliable it's going to be. And so the bottom line is, if you go with a Tier 1 combat quality handgun, you're probably just going to be getting a handgun that is wider. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be big in every other sense. This is a Tier 1 combat quality handgun. It's about the same size as this Tier 2 handgun. Now, it is a little bit bigger, but of course, it is quite a bit wider as well. That's because this gun is far more durable and far more reliable than this gun. Now, there's one other thing I want to leave you with in this chapter on handgun width, and that is that one of the most simple and quick to grab compromises that many engineers make when they're trying to design a more marketable concealed carry handgun is to simply lower the caliber of that gun. So they choose a smaller bullet, a smaller cartridge for that handgun. And that's simply because, the most clear and vivid example is to go from a 45 ACP cartridge down to a 380 cartridge. It's just a lot smaller. If you want a bigger caliber, the barrel obviously has to be bigger and the slide is going to be wider, therefore, just as a simple matter of dimensions, as a simple matter of how wide the increased cartridge is. And so in addition to my recommendation that you stick with a tier 1 combat quality handgun is of course that recommendation for a combat caliber, either the 9mm, the 9x19 Luger, or the 40 caliber Smith & Wesson, or the 45 ACP. If we go narrower than that, yes, we're going to come up with a far more marketable handgun for the private concealed carry market. But just remember all the things we're sacrificing and compromising on when we do that. We can do those things, we just got to remember what we're giving up, and we've got to be able to look ourselves and our family in the eye and say, it's worth it. Those compromises are indeed worth it to me.